Over. So I am an animal scientist, if you haven't figured that out. But I work in integrated crop livestock systems. And today I'm actually going to talk a little bit about selecting and grazing cover crops. And to the question that was earlier about how much added value do cover crops bring, in particular, that question was about interseeding. Jenny and her group got me very interested in that question. So we actually worked on putting a grant together, and the Corn Board just gave us funding to actually answer that question. So this spring, we're actually going to be doing some interseeding in corn, and we're going to graze it this fall. I will tell you our experience. We did some planting oats into high moisture corn, and we were kind of thinking, oh, that'll add value to the corn residue. And the lesson we learned when we did that a few years ago was that the cattle like the cover crop. Surprise, right? So they went and just ate all the cover crop first. Well, that didn't really work to extend our grazing season very much. So in this case, we are going to be doing the strip grazing, as was kind of suggested, to see how much added value we can get. So stay tuned. We'll tell you what we learn. But I do think there's some potential there from that interseeding. I got very excited when I went out and saw some of those fields and pictures and stuff. I was like, oh, this is exactly what I'm looking for. Because as we all know, it's very hard to get very much biomass when we're thinking about corn and soybean systems and trying to have a cover crop. And biomass is kind of the key when it comes to forage. We got to have biomass for them to be able to graze it. So the first thing when we're talking about selecting cover crops for grazing is don't skimp on the grass. A lot of times the grass is what's going to be king for producing biomass. And so we need to have enough grass in there. So what I'm going to talk about is nothing that's super fancy or maybe even exotic for many of you, because grasses are going to be the mainstay for grazing. Species selection then often depends on planting date. And that's probably one of the most common things that I hear is, oh, I tried that and it didn't work. And when we start talking, what usually comes up is they tried planting something like, let's say, turnips, which are winter sensitive, and I planted them in October, and I'm like, man, they didn't produce very much, right? Like, yeah, that's not going to work very well. So one of the key things about selection is when are you actually going to be able to plant it, and then when do you want to be able to graze it? So we're going to kind of talk a little bit more about that. So I kind of categorize our cover crop species, or in this case, our annual forages, because that's the way I'm looking at them, right? Cover crops, I'm using them for forage, into three categories. So we have our warm seasons, we have our cool seasons, and then our cool seasons, I break them into two categories that kind of tell us about when it might be appropriate to plant them. So warm seasons would be, most of you guys would be familiar with things like sorghum sudan, sudan grass, pearl millet's probably fairly common. Japanese millet's one that's kind of coming into the market, in my opinion. So there's some advantages to each of these for different reasons. But as a cover crop, honestly, the only system where these probably come into play is if you have wheat in your rotation. If you're wanting to do a double crop annual forage, then you've got some options. But otherwise, these are going to be planted the same time frame as when you're probably wanting to plant your cash crop, right? Your warm season corn or soybean. So we'll spend a little bit of time on these, but not very much. These are kind of the things where we have some options to work within our traditional cropping systems. So we have our winter sensitive species. So basically that just means they winter kill. Probably the most common ones that people think of are the small cereals like oats, spring barley, spring triticale, annual ryegrass. We talked a little bit about annual ryegrass earlier today. Field peas, or your brassicas like turnips and rapeseed. I will tell you that in terms of the winter sensitive species, I'm a big fan of oats. They're cheap, they work well, and I'm a big fan of the brassicas, especially for late summer planting, and I'll show you why. But from a forage perspective, they can have a lot of really high quality forage planted in the late summer. So after corn silage, for instance, if you have early harvested corn silage, winter hardy is probably what most people are familiar with, and most common cover crop, right? Cereal rye. So cereal rye, winter wheat, winter triticale, and then hairy vetch, is something that'll reliably overwinter. I will tell you from a forage perspective, I am a little bit nervous about hairy vetch, and I tend not to put it in if I'm going to use it for forage. And the reason is because hairy vetch does have the potential to produce a toxin that can make cattle photosensitive. I've had people who have success and don't have any problems. It's kind of Russian roulette. And I am a little bit risk adverse, so I don't play Russian roulette. So I do not use hairy vetch typically in mixes that I'm going to want to graze. I will tell you at small proportions, it's probably not a big deal. And if you are going to graze it when it's very immature, it's less of a problem. But if it happens to get mature or it overtakes and it's a lot of the biomass, there is a risk there. I wish we had more legumes that overwintered reliably because I think that's something we're missing. Okay, so timing is everything here. So I kind of broke it down based off of when you might be able to plant. And I put in red here, these are kind of the two time frames that I see most of us working in. But if we are, somebody talked about they were going to plant oats this spring to me earlier today, and they're going to graze those oats and then plant a soybean later. You can make that work. However, you are looking at planting fairly late, because if I spring plant oats or spring barley or spring wheat, whatever, I'm really looking at maybe May 15th before I can really start grazing. It takes about 30 to 45 days for it to really get going. And then if we look at time frame, the next time frame is really like not planting a cash crop and planting your warm seasons, or planting them after you harvest wheat, or maybe you're harvesting rye for grain. Then we're looking at some warm seasons. And if you're going to graze, Sudan grass is my favorite. And if you're going to graze in the grazing, like in the growing season. And the reason why I really like Sudan grass is that it regrows very well post-grazing. Some of the other warm seasons don't do quite as well, especially sorghum Sudan mixes. So that hybrid of sorghum Sudan, it does not regrow as well. Pearl millet doesn't regrow as well. I will tell you, Japanese millet regrows better than some of the other ones. So it's kind of a second best in my opinion. So that's an option, especially if you're wanting to graze into the time period where you're going to have a frost. Because the millets do not produce prussic acid when they get frosted on. Sudan grass does. So that's something else to think of. If you want to graze, like let's say in late September and there's a chance of a frost, that can catch you up. So there is kind of an option there to switch from Sudan grass if that's the case. But I'm going to spend most of my time here. This is where we kind of started most of our work, because I was kind of tasked with how do we add value to calves? And we were looking at, well, our calves are going to be weaned traditionally, right, in the fall, in October. And that's kind of the slump in prices. And so we were kind of like, well, what if we can grow them in the fall on some cover crops? And so oats and brassicas have become kind of my favorite mix for that. And I'll show you a little bit about that. You can also graze dry cows with it. That works just fine. In fact, the quality is so high, though, that I know we were talking about seed corn earlier, and that's basically just grazing brassicas with some corn residue, a little bit of corn residue, right? Does great, right? Lactating cows, they can do well. The quality is very, very high. If you want to use it for that, probably the way to get the most value out of it, again, is to limit access. So strip grazing, which takes extra labor, I realize. But for calves, we've been doing set stocking and getting really great gains. And then let's talk about winter hardy. Cereal rye is everybody's most common. Winter triticale is a little bit more expensive. It is an option. I'll tell you, in our systems, if we think about what the time frame is, I still think cereal rye makes a lot of sense, even for forage. And here's the reason. So the first thing is that cereal rye does tend to be a little bit more cold tolerant and come out of dormancy a little bit earlier than winter wheat or winter triticale. And that means we can get on it a little bit earlier. And if you're trying to fit it into a cropping system, being able to start grazing even a week earlier is an advantage, in my opinion. So I do like cereal rye from that perspective. But I do want to point out that there's probably just as much variation between varieties of a species as there is among species, it seems like. So I have a picture. This actually, Gary, this was one of Gary's fields that they had to prevent plant. And we planted, if I remember correctly, it was Elbon rye, VNS rye, there was a winter barley and a winter triticale. And I just wanted to put this picture up here. If you look on the TVs, you'll see it a little bit better, but these were planted on the same date. They had the same fertility. It's the same field. And you can see a difference in maturity. And that resulted in a difference in yield at the same time point. Why? Well, Elbon rye is a southern rye. So it comes out of dormancy even earlier than northern rye do. VNS can be anything because it's variety non-stated. They tend to be northern rye that we get here in Nebraska. And so it didn't come out of dormancy quite as early. It was not quite as far along as the Elbon. So there's an advantage, in my opinion, to having those southern type rye if you're looking for grazing, because again, we can get more grazing out of it earlier. I will say that in terms of quality, I hear a lot of people talk about rye and they think, man, that's low quality. And the truth is that it's all about maturity. So this is in that same field that I just showed you. This was actually samples taken at that time frame, that picture. And what you see is, I just really wanted to point out that between these varieties or species, excuse me, we don't see any real differences in quality. So this TDN is basically corn silage. So the energy content is similar to corn silage at that relative stage. So very, very high energy. And if you look at those crude protein numbers, that is good quality alfalfa right there. So my point is that if you manage it to keep it in the vegetative state, so keep it, short, keep it green, then you can have really, really good quality. In fact, you can have quality that will get 3.2 pound a day gain on calves. I had a producer tell me they could get 3 pound a day gain on calves. And I thought, no. I mean, I was like, nah, no, that's a fill thing. He weighed them. They were empty when they went out, and then they were full when they came back off. I was like, I had serious doubts. And I was wrong. And that does happen quite frequently, unfortunately. That's why I'm a scientist, right? We have hypotheses and then we test them. So this was actually Angela Knuth's field, where we were doing a study where we were actually comparing having rye versus not having rye, and then grazing rye as a part of the question. But what I really wanted to show you here is we can put out 700-pound calves and they can gain 3 pounds a day. And it is not a fill thing. We manage for fill in our research studies. So the quality is really good. A couple of things that we did learn. Annuals, they grow fast. And so it's very different than perennial forage management. So what you're used to grazing, if you're thinking about, grazing smooth brome grass, for instance, the management is very night and day. Good perennial grass managers probably find annuals a bit of a challenge at first because they want to grow so fast, and you try to be conservative when you're grazing. It is really important that you stay on top of it. So you got to have high stocking rates. In this case, we were stocking at 2 calves an acre. Started grazing in early April, and we pulled them off by May 10th so that we could plant the next cash crop. So relatively short grazing period, but good gains. And then the other thing that I'll point out is that you can make mistakes and overgraze, and it'll come back. This is what we kind of targeted for post-grazing. We were just doing like a back and forth rotation. This is not what it always looked like. I go out on a Friday and I'd be like, oh, I think they'll make it till Monday. And then you come out Monday and there's nothing left. And you go, man, I might have killed that. I did not. I will tell you that this stuff is very different because it's whole, I want to call it thought processes. I don't know, like plants think, but it's different in that it's not trying to remain viable in terms of growing a bunch of root structure so it can come back the next year. Its whole goal in life is to reproduce and produce seed. So it tends to do better even than what I would think of a perennial when we do severely graze it. Now, I'm not talking about overgrazing. If you severely graze it multiple times in a row, very quickly, you can kill it, but it's kind of hard to do. In fact, I've had producers who try to graze it out to plant their next crop, and it doesn't work. You pretty much have to herbicide kill it, okay? Because it's really hard to reduce the root stores enough to make it not be able to come back. Okay, so I get questioned a lot about rye versus triticale or wheat. In these systems where we're grazing for a shorter period of time because we're going to go into another crop, we really don't see much differences between the species. So this was the first year where we compared rye, triticale, and wheat. And what we did is we were trying to target start grazing at 5 inches of height. And the rye hit 5 inches about a week earlier than the triticale and wheat, so we went out early. Then we had a cold snap about a week later, and what that resulted in is that we actually probably got ahead of the rye a little bit. We ended up having to come off of it a little bit earlier, so we got the same number of grazing days between them. We got the same amount of gain on them, and you guys are looking at 4 pound a day. I should point out these calves had come off of stocks. They were gaining about 1 pound a day on stocks with the amount of supplement we were giving them. So probably a quarter of that gain, like 25%, was compensatory gain. They just gained a little bit better because we had restricted their growth earlier. So, but about 3 pound a day, still good stuff. Second year we did it, it looks a little different. So that fall was very dry when we planted, and the rye didn't really get going. None of them did. And so they all reached 5 inches about the same time. So we're like, okay, we'll turn out. Yeah. So the rye, the thing was that, again, we had that little bit of cold weather in early April after we turned out, and the rye wasn't phased to the extent that the triticale and wheat was. You could see damage, frost damage on those species, and it set it back. And so this is not a quality thing. This is, we restricted the intake on those calves. So where we didn't have as much restriction, same stocking rates, everything's the same. It just does better in the colder weather. So for me, I'm kind of a fan of rye if I'm going to be grazing it, especially early grazing. Key thing for all annuals, regardless of species, is that management is going to dictate the performance of the animal. And this is basically just showing early, like short vegetative stuff is going to be low yielding, right? But very high quality. And as you continue to let it mature, it gets lower and lower quality, and think feed value there, right? But higher yielding. Every time I hear somebody talk about an annual and say, oh man, that stuff's low quality, that's true. But they were over here. They were shooting for big yields. They hayed it off or something like that when it was maybe seeded out. And yeah, it's low quality. But even Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan, that everybody thinks of as kind of low quality, can be extremely high quality if you're hitting it over here. Okay, so let's talk about early spring planting. Again, it doesn't always fit into a good cash crop rotation, but in years like this year, where we're very short on forage, I've been getting a lot of ration questions lately about what in the heck do I feed? I have no hay left. So this is an option. You can plant it, late March, early April, and be able to start grazing it mid-May. If your pastures were set back this year because you overgrazed, this still might be a benefit, but it kind of doesn't typically line up. We usually can go out on pasture at that point. I do want to say that if you're looking at early spring planting, oats is a great option. Annual ryegrass might be even nice to add into the mix if you want to extend your grazing season. So that's something to think about. Let's talk about spring field peas because everybody's tired of grass right now, right? No? Okay. I did want to show you, there's a lot of data, but I just point out right here. So this was some work by Jerry Valesky and Darren Redfern, where they were looking at seeding rates of oats and peas. So this over here is peas alone. This over here was 70 pounds of oats alone, and then mixes in between. And one of the things that kind of comes up is you would expect if you add a legume in, you get more protein. not surprising. So 19% crude protein if it was the pea alone, going down to 9% if it was the oats alone. But this was kind of the one that kind of caught my eye. And that is we got the same amount of yield if they put in 50 pounds of oat with about 17 pounds of peas. So a little bit higher seed cost than oats alone, but we got some more protein out of the deal and same yield. Now this study was done about the same time, but it was before we knew. They did a seeding rate study on oats, and basically we've been telling you need to seed 90 pounds. An acre is typical seeding rate for oats for forage. They decided to question that, and I think the data really suggests that 50 pounds of oats is going to give you the same yield as 90, if that makes sense. So you can back off that seeding rate, which is kind of cool. I think that's probably, those rates were based off of 50s and 60s. Probably seedling vigor wasn't as good. Now we have better seedling vigor, so more of those plants survive, and that's probably why we can back off. So that's kind of useful information. It saves you some money. Okay, so warm season annuals. Most people are familiar with sorghum Sudan hybrids, and they're kind of good options if you're trying to do silage or hay if you manage it well. They've got big stems and they're hard to dry. But I really kind of wanted to talk about Sudan grass because it does, if you're looking to graze in the season, it regrows well. Japanese millet is another one. It likes wet feet. So if I'm looking for something for some wetter areas, Japanese millet might be an option. If I'm looking for drier areas, pearl millet's actually a fairly good option. And there's some pearl millet varieties that yield as well as sorghum Sudan if I was going to hay it. So that might be a great option if you're on some hillsides or something that's a little bit drier. It does not like wet feet though. So the advantage of the millets, in my opinion, is that they do not produce the prussic acid. So you can get on them maybe a little bit earlier, not have to worry about prussic acid when they're short, and then also at the frost period. Foxtail millet or German millet, you guys might have heard of. It's a very quick maturing, very low yielding. I see it used more in the West as a way to get a second crop in. It's very cheap, so if it fails, it's not that big of a deal. So they'll put it in after wheat. But it's one of those where it takes 60 days to get to full maturity, and it does not yield very much. So there's kind of two time frames that I think about seeding for the warm seasons. One is seeding exactly when you would think about seeding, sorghum, kind of that May time period. It likes the temperatures to be around 60 in the soil. 65 is ideal, so warmer, right? Or you can delay and plant like after your wheat. And in my mind, this kind of makes sense for stockpiling. And there's actually some really interesting stuff they're doing in Iowa right now where they're actually stockpiling it, and then they're cutting around this time and actually swathing it then and grazing it and getting really great utilization rates to allow them to get more cows per acre, if that makes sense. So I'm kind of intrigued by that. I'd been a little bit hesitant in the East to do something like that because of the moisture. I think the key is that they're waiting to actually cut it. So it's kind of dried in the field. And then they just wait until right before they think they're going to get a snow or something, and then they cut it. Okay, so these are kind of your options. And I really just wanted to show you that in my mind for grazing, these are kind of the two that I might think about: Sudan grass or pearl millet, depending on the timing. In-season grazing, this is more for stockpile or fall grazing that I don't want to deal with the prussic acid issue. And I just wanted to show you that, foxtail millets doesn't really yield very well. Teff is, in my opinion, hard to get going because you got to have the seed bed just right. And again, yield-wise, not great. So I really think these are great options. And I think this one is really only an option for silage, just FYI. All right, so this, I wanted to show you, just again, trying to convince you. Quality is all about timing. So this is sorghum Sudan. This is probably one of the ones everybody's most familiar with. And again, if we look at early vegetative, so like when I would want to be grazing it, like in this time frame, we're very, very high energy. We're, again, Not quite corn silage, maybe drought stress corn silage in terms of energy content, but great energy and really good crude proteins. It's just when you start getting down into this stage that we get into lower quality, right? So the idea is you can match the quality with the requirement of the animal. If I have a dry cow and I'm just trying to get her through until stocks, for instance, or I don't have access to stocks, then letting some of this stuff get mature and doing something where you can strip it, maybe it makes sense. But I just want to point out that, like, think about staging if you're thinking about quality less. I think you need to think about that more than you need to think about species selection, if that makes sense. So for summer grazing, like while it's growing, suggestion is that it takes about 45 days for something like Sudan grass to get ready to be able to be grazed. You don't want to graze until it's 2 foot. Maybe you can get to 18 inches on Sudan grass, and that's because you do have prussic acid in those little plants. And then you want to be pretty aggressive about doing a rotation. You got to keep up with it, and you got to keep it vegetative, because there's 2 things going on there. One is quality, and the other one is regrowth. If it gets mature, it will not regrow after grazing. So if you want to get the most out of it, you're going to want to be able to kind of keep it down there to where it's not getting too tall and too mature too quickly. And then we actually suggest leaving about 6 inches for it to be able to regrow from. I don't know if anybody's got experience grazing warm seasons, but one of the things that happens is if it gets away from you and then you graze it, it'll just make these little spindly tillers and doesn't grow very much anymore. So it's kind of disappointing when that happens. So you kind of got to manage based off of height, right? So sometimes that means quicker moves to keep up with it, even if you're not utilizing everything that you graze through. Okay, so let's talk about late summer planting real quick. I know I'm hitting you with a lot of information. Again, I was kind of telling you, my favorites right now are oats and rapeseed. And the reason why I like rapeseed is because it produces this nice little taproot rather than a tuberous root, which most people think of when you think of purple top turnip or even a radish. Taproots are great for compaction, right? They're also great because it puts a lot of energy into producing leaf, which means that for grazing perspective, I can manage my grazing better and maintain ground cover, which I really like. If I use something like a purple top turnip or a radish, they put a lot of energy into making those tubers. And if I want to make use of it, I pretty much have to have them eat all the grass first and all the leaf off of those brassicas, and then they'll start eating the tubers. By the time we're done, we have bare ground. With a mix of oats and rapeseed, I can kind of manage how much material I have left and make use of more of the energy that brassica is producing for me. So after early harvested corn silage, oats and brassicas can produce a lot of biomass and be really, really high quality feed, because the oats don't actually try to mature if you plant them late enough. If you plant them in August, if you plant them in July, they will do nothing but try to go to seed, and they are very low quality. So timing matters, right? But here's the other end of timing matters. The other end of timing matters is if I plant oats too late, I get nothing. So this was oats planted September 3rd. I got about a ton and a quarter or so off of it. And I planted on the same field 2 weeks later and got 500 pounds an acre. That looks like that, right? Not very much. So I'm better off at this point, middle of September, to go to the winter hardy species like cereal rye rather than planting oats. But if I do get it planted early enough, the quality is amazing. So this is better than corn silage. It's high quality in terms of protein. I call it corn silage and alfalfa in a river. It's really good stuff. In early November, that's when we usually have been putting our calves out after they're weaned. And then it melts down and looks horrible. And the first year I did this, the crew kept calling me and saying, there's nothing out here for them to eat. We need to pull them. And I'd be like, no way. I was just out there like 2 days ago. There was plenty. Because neither of those, the oats or the brassicas, have any kind of structural material in them because they didn't try to mature. So as soon as they get frost killed, they melt down and they look like there's nothing there. You have to actually go out there and kind of fluff it up to see that there's anything there. That's a good thing from a quality perspective, because that means most of the carbohydrates are very readily available to the animal. So quality-wise, still good, even when it's brown and ugly. It does lose a little bit of energy. Now it's more like drought-stressed corn silage and alfalfa. So still really great stuff. And we can get, on average, I typically get between 1.3 and 2 pound a day gain. 1.3 is in a bad year where it's not cold. Actually, cold has not been our major problem. It's precipitation. If we have a little bit warmer weather and a bunch of precipitation events, we don't get as good of gains. This was actually a 5-year study where we planted oats onto corn silage, and these calves were getting ready to be pulled. But I wanted to show you one thing, and that it was down here. Each year, we looked at the harvest efficiency. That just means how much grazing did we get relative to the amount of biomass that was out there. Everybody likes to think that we were going to get 50%. Some years we got 40, some years we got 13. It depended on the weather and how much they trampled in, right? So on average, we were about 30%. And that made me kind of disappointed, because I was like, man, there's a lot of forage that disappeared that didn't go into the animal. It went into the soil, which can be a positive, right? But I started wondering, how much can we get if we just stripped or done something like that? And out at US Mark, they were giving them about a week's worth at a time, and we were giving them about 70 to 90 days worth at a time, right? Make it easy, set them out there, let them go until it's done. The difference was they were getting about double the amount of grazing we were. And so same amount of biomass and double the grazing. So I started going, well, is that worth it? So we actually did the head-to-head comparison out on one of the fields that the Canoes had. We planted oats and rapeseed, and we basically continuous grazed or provided them access to the whole field for 70 days, or we strip grazed it, moving twice a week. We almost doubled the amount of grazing that we got off of that field. It did reduce their ability to select a little bit, so individual animal performance decreased just a tinch, but total gain per acre increased significantly, right? Basically, if I'm looking at the economics and how much I can get out of it, stripping it made a lot of sense. One of the things that we're wanting to do now is look at ways to reduce the labor associated with strip grazing, because we all know labor is always a challenge, right? So one of my colleagues is a technology guru. I am not, but we're actually going to try using virtual fencing to see if we can do it when strip graze it, which kind of be fun. But this is kind of what it looked like. This is that field early in the season where we were stripping it. This stuff was planted the 1st of August, and so it did have a head on it, but still super high quality. You saw they got 1.5, 2 pound a day gain. And this is what it looked like in February. There's a lot of snow there. A couple things that we noticed. One is that where we were strip grazing, the snow caught into the oats, right? The oats that was standing that hadn't been knocked down, of course, held the snow. Good from a soil moisture perspective. Made me a little bit nervous. And this was, 1.5 feet of snow out there. And we ended up one day in about this time, probably it was this time, it was really, really, really cold. And we thought, man, I think we need to provide them something. So we decided to supplement all the calves, sweet bran. And the calves who were out on the continuous graze went straight to the sweet bran. The calves who were on strip grazing had gotten a new strip. They didn't care about the sweet bran. They were going to town finding all the rapeseed that was in there in that snow. So that was actually a really cool moment for me, because it made me realize that as long as we don't have something that's crusted over, they can graze through quite a bit of snow. And as you saw, they gained well. So last thing here is just like, you can take that to the extreme. This was out at US Mark, and they had some oats and brassicas that was planted after corn silage. And they took a pivot fence and they moved every day, and they limit fed these cows basically on this. So they were giving about 1/8 of an acre to about 400 cows. I was like, holy smokes. I went out there and was looking at it, and they're like, how did you determine how much to give them? And they're like, well, we just kept moving it and playing around with how much until they cleaned up about the way we wanted. And so then, of course, the nutritionist came in and did math, back of the napkin math. And I was like, wow, they actually about hit it straight on target for maintaining a dry cow. I was pretty impressed. But look, the AUMs they got were basically 4 times what we would normally be getting. So this is like the extreme example of harvest efficiency. And you still had decent cover, which I was surprised by. Okay, so I will tell you there's another reason why I like oats and rapeseed, beyond the fact that when we planted rapeseed, we got a boost in gain. And for any cattle people in here, you're like, that's not very much difference. How'd you pick that up? It's called having a lot of replication and genetics that were similar. But we could get a little bit of boost in performance on the calves. But the coolest thing was that we compared marbling. So we finished those calves out after these trials. And the thing was that where we had the rapeseed in the mix, they marbled as well as calves who had been put onto a corn silage and corn-based grower ration. And they marbled better than those who were put on the oats, which was a little bit surprising to me. I did not think during the backgrounding period, because they only grazed for about 90 days, that it would matter. But it did, apparently, and the rapeseed was kind of a little bit magical. So that was something that was kind of cool. All right, so if you guys are interested, we do have a planting guide which kind of outlines timing, seeding rates, seeding depths, and even some suggestions in terms of what to plant in terms of mixes. So it's on this go.unl.edu plant guide. And of course, Darren and I are here. So if you have questions that are specific to your operation, we'd be happy to answer them. And I think we have a few minutes so we can answer questions in front of the group as well.
How'd you keep them calves from bloating, feeding them rape?
Oh, okay. So the question was, how did I keep the calves from bloating when they were grazing rape? That's a great question. And that is, I never grazed just straight rape. So I've always put it in a mix with oats, and we've never had a problem with bloat. In fact, it takes them a little bit to figure out that they like the rapeseed. So early in the grazing season, they don't select for it, and then they start selecting for it later in the grazing season. But we've never had any issue with bloat, in fact, with that mix. And I think it's because we have enough fiber in the oats. So it's working for us. So Randy's question was, do I have to do anything special before we turn them out? And the answer was no, we didn't do anything. I mean, honestly, I would be much more nervous if I had a bunch of a legume in there than a brassica for bloat.
Have you done the GPS collars yet, or is that what's coming?
That's
virtual grazing.
Yeah, that's what's coming. We haven't done it yet. Well, they have some out at GSL right now that they've been using on rangeland. We haven't done it in these confined systems yet, like more on cropland where you're going to have smaller areas. So that's actually what we're trying to get going this year with trying to do rotational grazing on cropland as well as strip grazing. So we'll see. I have high hopes anyways. There is some data from other states, and it looks promising.